there's a couple of forces at play here that factor into this. The first one is, historically, e-commerce creative production has been viewed as basically a cost center for every business. And the history here, I'll give you the really abridged one. The modern day e-commerce photo studio was really born out of the 2008 recession. And there's a couple of things. One thing is the recession itself, but there's a couple of a confluence of other events that are around the same time. 2008, the recession happened. Tons of companies who were not interested in embracing e-com realized that they needed to diversify in some way, because there were some segments of e-com that weren't hit as hard as brick and mortar stores were. And so there was that part of it. It sort of, I mean, I think it would have gotten there anyway, similar to what we saw with e-com during COVID. We would have gotten there, but it accelerated it. But the other thing is, there was all these flash sale sites that popped up. And this was a little bit in response to the recession. What, you know, and for your audience might remember, like Hotlook.com, myhabit.com, all these sites that had deeply discounted, usually fashion products, but it could be a lot of different things. But the thing that was unique about them is they were digital first. These were not usually legacy companies or brick and mortar companies that were adapting into this. They were digital first, and they had sales that had to go on every day. And those sales needed images to support that product. It was the only way to sell it. And so they were building studios that they had constant flow of product day in, day out. It never stopped. Product would come in, it needed to be shot, it needed to go through its entire process, and then get into the asset management tool, and then get onto the web. So along with that was like, I call them e-commerce aggregate companies that were going around and buying successful Amazon third-party sellers and then kind of conglomerating them into something. They were opening studios. And then a lot of the legacy companies like Gap brands were like, you know, they already had studios, but they were like, we can consolidate our studios and build an e-com studio machine. And that's kind of how all of this stuff sort of happened. So the industry that we're in is literally young. It literally was born out of that, right? 2008 era, kind of gaining speed. Around 2015, Amazon, I think, peaked in this regard. Amazon was building studios that appeared so futuristic, it was like mind-blowing, building automated imaging devices, complex workflows. And the thing that was really mind-blowing was like how much money they were investing in this process, because a big metric in these studios is, what does it cost to produce one image? And I remember being like, looking at an Amazon studio with like 200 people, and I'm like, what this has got to be like $300, $400, $500 per image that it costs. It turns out, no, they figured out that if we chop it up and put people in the right roles and let them focus on the thing they're good at, we do it fast enough that it you know, it evens out. Our costs stay relevant. So because of all of that, the other thing you have to understand is that the workforce is just barely getting into something that resembles maturity. We just now have professionals that come from the e-commerce studio that have 10 years of experience, but they probably only have 5 or 6 years of experience as a photographer, as a stylist, as a samples administrator, and if only a few years of experience in like a leadership position, and maybe only 1 year of experience procuring tools for their own studios. So we're just barely getting to the point where the workflow, or literally the workforce that powers these studios, not just the industry, is mature. And in some cases, I've been in studios given demos where the studio manager only has ever worked at that studio and has been pretty insulated from, you know, other studios' best practices. And I was just actually having a really interesting conversation about this right before we hopped on to record this, Ethan. I was reflecting on retention has always been an issue in creative roles. It always kind of feels like the average thing is like 18 months to 2 years, and then you rotate around companies. And I was thinking about the impact that had on the spread of best practices and the sort of homogenization of the industry itself. Because as people were working for Amazon for 2 years and going to work for Nordstrom for 2 years and then going to work for Farfetch for 2 years, a really interesting anecdote in our industry actually is Amazon pretty much had the Midwest on lock when it came to studio jobs. If you wanted to be a commercial photographer, Amazon was basically the only scaled up studio that you could get a job in. And then Rue Gilt Group moved to Kentucky and opened a studio, and there was a mass exodus from Amazon to people to that studio. Now they had an option, right? And you can see that. You can sort of trace, if you like, you know, maybe being a chief evangelist a little bit is like an archaeologist for your industry in some ways, because you start to see traces of best practices from these places. But you still have these studios that grew up in isolation. The studio manager who's worked for 10 years in that studio and is actually totally unaware of some of the ways that other studios are working and some of the things that they've solved for. And so, yeah, evangelism in some ways it becomes about reaching out to those people and saying, like, one of the things that we do that I really love doing is when we sponsor one of these industry events and conferences, part of that package is usually some passes. And I try to think, like, who can I get to come to this conference, give them a pass to this conference that has never been to it, that I think would benefit from it. Because it really is teasing all those people out from where they are, and like, continuing to kind of homogenize this industry in a way that, I don't want everybody to look the same, but the studios all already do the same thing. It's just that they don't realize they're all doing the same thing, that they have the same problems that every other studio has. And they can fix some of those things and still continue to sort of retain their individual identity, but actually build something that resembles a best practice and alleviates some of the problems that they have.